Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second Open to Export webinar of the day. This time we are looking at what importers and exporters need to know about the easing of lockdown restrictions from a global trade perspective. My name is William Barnes-Graham and I am the Senior Content Editor at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Just a quick note to say that we are all dialing in from home connections as per social distancing advice. So if there is a lag, please do bear with us. Next slide, please. Open to Export is a free online service helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, and our Export Action Plan tool. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Next, please. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders. Endorsed by the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as a small business champion, we offer a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious program of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. Next, please. The Institute continues to operate online, offering a range of digital support and telephone assistance throughout the pandemic, including digital training courses and export masterclasses, international trade surgeries, which can be conducted over the phone, online qualifications provided by both the Institute and the UK Customs Academy, daily bulletins bringing you all the key trade stories, and of course, the free trade articles and webinars on the Open to Export platform. With the government recently confirming that the transition period will end at the end of 2020, we do recommend you continue your Brexit preparations, especially as many of the Institute's relevant courses are still fully fundable by government grants. You can find out more information about all of our support on export.org.uk, and please feel free to contact us if you have any queries. Next, please. We will be running a live Q&A later in the session, and you can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. The general principle we will adopt is that we'll only ask questions that are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't be able to go into company specifics as such, but if you do have such questions, we can refer you to our technical helpline afterwards. We will also be avoiding any speculative or political questions because we are here to give factual and practical advice and guidance. You can also download a PDF of the slides at any point via the handout drop-down, or email us at admin@opentoexport.com and we can email the PDF of the slides, and a recording will be made available on opentoexport.com/webinars within a day of it finishing. Next, please. Now, before we hand over to our speaker today, we're going to run a few of our COVID-19 tracking polls today, beginning with this question. So the question is, what has been the main impact of COVID-19 on your business? The options include delays at customs, cash flow issues, staff off sick, decline in demand for our services, and a rise in price of freight transport. And while I'll give you a few seconds to answer this question, I'd just like to say hello to our presenter today, a regular on our webinar program, the Director of Stakeholder Engagement at the Institute of Export, Kevin Shakespeare. Hi, Kevin.
Oh, hello, Will. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. And for those of you that were on the webinar we held this morning, or the roundtable with questions, welcome again. So it's a pleasure to be able to present and speak more around the impacts of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'm just going to give people a couple more seconds to answer that poll. And I'll give it a 5-second countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to close the poll now and share the findings. So, as has often been the case with these polls, decline in demand for our services has been the top impact, but a rise in freight transport prices has gone up a little bit to 27%. Usually decline is a bit further ahead. Cash flow issues continue to be an issue. They're rising as well, sadly. but the good news is that not too many people's staff are off sick at the moment, so at least that's a saving grace. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kevin. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you. So on today's webinar, we'll follow up from previous webinars that were held in March and April. So effectively, this is the third webinar related to COVID-19 and its impacts. And yes, we will continue to update and look at the impacts from trade, customs, logistics, and supply chain perspectives. But also today, want to maybe try and cover some different aspects. So start to look to the future in terms of new technologies, how trade will start to look different in the future, and also get your view and feedback on that. So really now starting to look at what future trade will mean for businesses. So the context again of today's webinar is clearly domestic and international trade continues to be impacted by the virus. But some countries are coming out of lockdown to varying degrees, but the way we're doing business is changing. We're all having to adapt. So in terms of the content to update today, we'll look at the latest trade news. We're also going to look at trade liberalizations versus trade restrictions, which is an interesting dynamic we're seeing in world trade. The overall impact on world trade of COVID-19, specifically at the COVID-19 commodity code list, which is becoming an increase in list, and we'll talk about that. And looking at trade in the future, and ending on a clearly always important aspect, professionalisation and training. So let's look at some of the latest headlines first of all. This is one of the more detailed slides. So if we look at the top and the top boxes, we can see that businesses in economies credit ratings are suffering. Cash flow and we obviously had your feedback in the poll, thank you very much, is being impacted, and that's very much worldwide, and that's having an impact on payment terms, which we'll talk about later. Freight rates remain volatile. Yes, air freight rates have fallen in the last week and slightly lower demand for PPE, but yes, freight rates are heavily influenced by supply and demand, and the increased costs of certainly moving goods by air has been noticeable since the outbreak of COVID-19. So volatility, unfortunately, is still there. There's still blank sailings taking place, which either means that large vessels, transshipment, large vessels, containerized vessels are not calling at certain ports, or in some cases just not sailing in the first place. Commodity price is an interesting one. So oil has generally been lower in 2019, a slight pickup recently. Gold has been a lot higher. Gold is seen as a safe haven, and cocoa prices are lower. Why have I chosen these three? Well, oil clearly is important as a commodity for most businesses, and clearly very important to some countries. Gold is hugely important as well. So a lot of, for example, the economies of Africa will be driven by gold, for example, and cocoa as well is also Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are probably the two largest cocoa producers in the world, is also impacted as well. So the impact on not just developing nations, but developed nations of commodity prices and their businesses is absolutely fundamental. In earlier webinars, we talked about the restrictions on exports, for example, of PPE. So the European Union introduced those restrictions at the height of the crisis, but on the 26th of May, those restrictions were lifted. But as a sort of talked about on other webinars and other masterclasses that the Institute's involved in, there is a need to recognise that these restrictions, depending what happens, can be put back in place. Last time we saw the impact of the restrictions on exports of PPE, and clearly in the event of a second outbreak, that could take place. So I will be referring to examples of trade liberalisation and trade restrictions. It's probably fair to say on the import side that there's been liberalisations around duty and VAT rates, for PPE, medical devices, and also manufacturing components, and also research as well. So goods that are important for researching linked to COVID-19 are also generally liberalized, because research materials are also very important. Trade restrictions, so the European Union has lifted its restrictions, but those restrictions are in place. And when we look at an example of China and its restrictions, I think we do need to consider that restrictions are not just requiring an export license for exports of PPE and making an application. And many of those applications in the European Union were approved during the restriction period, I must add. But also restrictions in terms of conformity and liability. So when we look at the example of China later on, bear that in mind. To actually export goods and import goods, in some cases, there will be additional procedures required if the product is important to the actual export, to the exporting country. We have seen recently in Beijing that some cities and localities are seeing spikes or new reported cases. So that will have an impact on supply chains. Clearly China is important to a number of companies in terms of your supply chain. But what it reinforces is the need for supply chains to be flexible. One of the outputs we've talked in previous webinars on COVID-19 was the need to look potentially at more national, regional supply chains, or at least have a range of suppliers. And this potential for local outbreaks just causes, just reinforces the importance of that supply chain strategy. Equally, if your sales are heavily reliant on one locality and one large customer, an impact from COVID-19 could have a disproportionate impact on your business if you have a key customer dependency. 2020 will clearly be a year of decline in trade, and we'll look at some examples from IMF statistics, whereas hopefully 2021 will be a year of increases. So the reason for putting that, we'll call out some statistics shortly, is to say for those of you who are considering exporting for the first time, considering increases in your exporting, now is more important than ever to consider your export strategy, but also the fulfillment side. So we talked about on this morning's webinar that the government announcement that there is a further £50 million in grant funding to support customs, trade, documentation, or operational procedures. So now is the time to professionalize your business. And I appreciate a lot of companies have done that already. But if you haven't, train more people up in your business to understand about how trade works. We will briefly look at Brexit, not too much, because it's not the purpose of today's webinar. But if you're looking to export, professionalize, because one thing, as I previously referred to many times, is that Brexit, with a post-transition period, that companies will be looking at trade with other parts of the world. So the opportunity now to professionalize at the end of a transition period with new procedures in place is very much there, and to try and take advantage of those opportunities against a background of increase in trade. So if you're considering exporting for the first time, considering new markets, for example, outside the European Union, it's a really good time in that respect. And also think about your products and what products you'll be exporting. But the operational procedures of exporting are really important to learn and understand. Let's now look at a global summary of temporary export measures. This was at the 17th of June. And here we can see that there were, from the International Trade Centre's market access map, we can see that export restrictions were in place in 95 countries in the world. That's still a lot. And as we're going to look at, for example, with China, those restrictions are not just a blanket ban on exports. They're not just requiring an export license. There are other types of restrictions. And generally, they're around PPE, personal protective equipment, pharmaceutical products, hand sanitizers, and in some cases, foods, certain food products and products that impact food manufacturing. But export liberalisation is only in place in 2 countries. But 139 countries, there's no temporary export measures. So I would hope that would obviously increase the countries with no restrictions, but as that we have a changing picture on COVID-19 in terms of outbreaks, with clearly South America now being very high in terms of number of cases. That will have an impact on businesses. So Europe potentially starting to come more out of lockdown, but South America now more impacted. So we can see the impacts there. But let's look specifically at China. I've talked about China. So China introduced a regulation in late April, and the reason for putting this is I know China is still very important for supply chain for a number of businesses. So exporting companies of non-medical use face masks, and the key there is non-medical, need to submit a joint declaration of the exporter and the importer in writing or in an electronic form together with a customs declaration. And so the importer is involved in this process now as a confirmation that the products are compliant with the quality standards of China or other countries. So the importer, if you're the UK importer, is having to make that declaration. So it's to some extent trying to not make sure that sole liability is on the Chinese exporter. The importer accepts the quality standards of the products purchased and does not use them for medical purposes. So there's a fair amount of disclaimers here, or responsibility, liability on the importer, which was introduced by Chinese customs. And this is an example of the types of restrictions or requirements, conformity, almost guarantees, you could say, that are needed to export from some countries. And you've got a website there which has details of the communication from the Ministry of Commerce in China. So even when you're importing, you do need to consider the procedures in other countries. Just as if you're an exporter, you're looking at import controls, exchange control, customs regulations, trade compliance in the importing country. For your sales, your export sales, you also need to consider the requirements in the exporter's country as well. And this is going to become more important. COVID-19 is going to introduce more of these restrictions, or requirements is probably a better way of putting it. Now let's look at import measures. So currently import restrictions 11, so there's only 11 countries with import restrictions. Well, that's good because it's more around liberalizations. So 108 countries have import liberalizations with respect to COVID-19. Again, the same types of products and that we talked about under export. But 106 countries do not have any liberalizations in place. We're going to look shortly at the European Union, the UK, in terms of their liberalization around COVID-19 shortly. But we can see 108 countries with those import liberalizations to try and encourage the import of much needed COVID-19 products. Now, one thing I do want to mention, we had a masterclass last week on PPE, personal protective equipment, is we get this sort of question a lot from UK importers. Well, what are the requirements before I place PPE on the UK market? And it's a good question, but it's also a very important question. And a lot of it is around the CE mark, the conformity mark for placing goods on the European Union market. And during the transition period, the UK still the CE mark is still applicable to the United Kingdom. So the CE mark is an essential requirement around importing PPE, medical devices, and many other products as well. Any products that have a health, safety, environmental protection standards. CE mark is fundamental. And the EU has introduced some emergency legislation in the EU recommendation 2020-403 around use of conformity and CE mark. The main EU regulation 2016-425 is still in place. But increasingly, there's this new regulation as well, which could be temporary. We'll have to wait and see. but it indicates there is, in theory, some leeway from total use of the CE mark. In theory. In practice, we have to wait and see. So the EU recommendation regulation indicated that PPE can be placed on the market if it meets essential safety requirements and provided conformity assessment procedures have taken place. And that last point is really important. Has to take place, those conformity assessment procedures, via a notified body, a notifying body, which is invariably the same notified bodies that issue the CE mark as part of conformity testing. So most parts of PPE are deemed to be as higher risk, not all PPE, and we can provide further information as to what types of PPE are classified as higher risk. But the role of a notifying body is important, and again, the Europa EU site indicates the UK organisations that are approved to be notifying bodies. I think there's roughly around 12, 15, so it's not a huge number of organisations. Now, with regard to the UK, for a limited time for COVID-related PPE, the emphasis clearly was to being purchased by the government, the National Health Service, to support health workers, care workers, and also charities as well, like the Salvation Army, Red Cross, for example. And there was guidelines there that is, providing it is being manufactured in line with a relevant European standard, an ES standard, for example, and in accordance with the WHO, the World Health Organization guidelines, it could be imported without the requirement for the CE mark. But those products procured in that way must be approved in the UK by the Market Surveillance Authority. So there's no guarantee. Clearly, if you're a supplier to the National Health Service or the NHS is purchasing direct, that there will be prioritization there. But it just goes to show that there are regulations around the import of PPE. A lot of companies are considering getting into this area, so to speak, or setting up businesses in this area, but everybody must be aware of the regulations. Hence the emphasis in this slide on the requirement for the CE mark. Now, impacts of COVID on world trade. Let's spend some time considering this slide. So, having indicated earlier that the forecast in terms of gross domestic product, the output of goods and services, generally in 2020, most countries in the world will see a decline in economic growth. And this was the International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Economic Outlook in April. There's a further report coming out in July, and it's going to be interesting to see if these figures are, how these figures vary, whether they're potentially going to be even more dramatic in terms of reductions in 2020. But the April figures from the IMF considered that most countries in the world, especially the advanced economies, were going to see quite dramatic declines, with an uptake from lower bases in 2021. So clearly that's important, and the IMF report covers every country effectively in the world. I've just picked out some countries. So the advanced economy is clearly affected. Then you have the emerging developing Asia. So if you look at China and India, still forecast to grow, but that does depend on the impact of COVID-19. So considering India and China and recent circumstances, that could in theory turn to a negative forecast, but with higher growth next year as those economies generally are growing more. The ASEAN 5, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so some of the big ASEAN, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, for example, Thailand, are seeing slightly negative growth, but generally overall bigger growth next year as those are faster growing economies. The Middle East and Central America, so I picked out Saudi Arabia as an example, is negative growth and positive growth in 2021. Clearly, the price of oil will be hugely impactful for Saudi Arabia. Latin America and the Caribbean, negative. And sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa as a whole, is quite interesting because though Africa has the fastest growing economies in the world, the likes of Ethiopia, Rwanda, for example, and Ghana was probably predicted to be the fastest growing economy in the world this year. And those economies generally, because they are fast growing, are still showing positive growth. In the case of Ghana, the price of gold is clearly important, the price of oil is important, the price of cocoa is important. So you can see the impact of commodities on certain African economies, but still generally growth, but the impact of COVID-19 is still to be impacted. And it's fair to say that countries like the United Kingdom, in terms of vaccines and other remedies, are prioritizing developing nations. Least developed nations in terms of the exports of these products, after obviously serving the UK national need. So again, that's something to consider in your trade strategy, is if there is a prioritization on the least developed nations or the lower income nations, does that do you need to start considering exports to those nations, bearing in mind that exporting to a developing nation is different to exporting to a developed nation. So let's look at the impact of COVID-19 on country ratings, and we're going to use COFAS, the Trade Credit Insurance, as an example, and they have 7 categories of rating, from A1 down to D. So not surprisingly, there's been a number of downgrades in the COFAS ratings, as highlighted in the blue boxes here. So can pick out any country we want, but we can see general downgrades. We can see a number of countries that are downgraded to C and D. What that means for exporters is that there is greater country risk when you're exporting. The buyer might pay, and the buyer might be a state organization, a government, or a large oil company, for example. But it means with exchange control regulations, as I'm sure some of you will be aware, that the country can block payments. So the country might not have enough money to pay. It might be growing so fast that it's got to control the flow of money, which is the case, for example, in some African nations. Their economies are growing fast, or it cannot get enough hard currency, such as US dollar, to actually make payment. So the higher the level of country risk, the more you have to consider the payment methods that you apply. So that becomes very, very important. And whilst some exports say, well, I'll just ask for advance payment from these countries. Well, in some cases, the exchange control regulations require that the country companies are not allowed to pay money out of country unless trading is under a documentary letter of credit or a documentary bank collection. And India, for example, could also be an example of that. So the higher the risk doesn't mean that, oh, I'm just going to ask for advance payment or 80% payment up front. You might not be able to achieve that, which is why businesses have to look at involvement in more instruments like documentary letters of credit, so that UK companies can export more to these countries, and that's increasingly going to be important going forward. Asia Pacific and Europe, we can see various downgradings there, and a number of downgradings with European countries that generally would be seen as high performing. Germany, A3, and Germany, as we saw from an earlier slide, negative GDP this year. So higher risks across the board there that we wouldn't have necessarily considered. The United Kingdom, A4. Ireland, A4. So we can see the impact there. Now, there are, as such, limited exchange or no exchange control regulations on the flow of money out of the UK and Germany, but it starts to show, you can start seeing some countries move into B. Italy, for example. Could there be exchange control regulations? There's got to be a further decline in the credit rating before we start to get into the C categories, where we potentially could look at that as well. Greece, there are exchange control regulations. Money has to be approved by the Central Bank of Greece. Initially, Greece is a B in the category. So look at the country risk, because if you're looking to export, you must be aware of this and consider documentary letters of credit. Now, I referred earlier to a COVID-19 commodity code list. So the World Customs Organization produced a link, and these slides will be available to you, and you have the web links here, which started to create a commodity code list, which said to countries that you can introduce special procedures, whether it's around import duty and VAT, and any other simplification procedures around COVID-19. The European Union extended that list, you have the web link on this slide, and added products such as monitors, humidifiers to the commodity code list. And the UK has then produced its own commodity code list, including sterilisation products, disinfectants as well, and clearly medicines. So it's important to know that list if you're importing goods, but it's also important to look at a world list in terms of exporting as well. And you've heard me, or some of you have heard me before, expressing the importance of getting a commodity code correct. This is just another example of getting the commodity code correct, so that if your commodity is a valid one for the purposes of COVID-19 products. Payments and trade terms we've talked about, and speaking with a few of the banks, we are seeing increases in use of documentary letters of credit, partly for the reasons I outlined earlier. But documentary letters of credit provide a structure to a transaction as well. The documents are linked to the method of payment. So very much it's to some extent where the physical supply chain through the documentation that evidences movement of goods links to the financial supply chain. So there has been an increase, a spike in the number of letters of credit in various countries. And that's not just UK companies, that's French companies, that's German companies. So competitor nations, competitor companies are seeing the need for more documentary credits, whether you're an exporter in terms of trying to reduce the payment risk, and also if you're an importer in terms of quality assurance. So for example, on an import letter credit, use of independent inspection certificates to actually inspect the goods. So increase there. So think about the payment methods. I know of many companies that every single transaction, importer or exporter, has to go through the finance department, the credit control department, to make sure that everything is reviewed whilst countries and companies effectively ratings are being reviewed. Brexit announcements. I'm not going to go into this too much, but there's been a few announcements since our last COVID-19. And I appreciate some of you may be involved in the various webinars and masterclasses we've held. So the UK announced its global import tariff. There's been increasing focus on the Northern Ireland Command Paper. The UK had announced, which was our webinar this morning, a three-stage process around import controls that would apply from 1st of January 2021. Trade negotiations continue with the European Union, but they've commenced with the likes of the United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And in our daily bulletins, we're keeping you up to date with what's happening there. So again, think about your trade strategy as to what could happen in the direction of potential new trade deals, as the UK is now able to negotiate its own trade deals. And also trading relations with English-speaking countries abroad are also a priority. So I was on the phone yesterday to contacts in Jordan, and the Institute are doing work in a number of these English-speaking countries currently, around the prioritization or the opportunities for companies in the United Kingdom as a whole to export and look at opportunities in these countries. But again, being aware of the risks, being aware of the payment mechanisms, being aware of customs and trade procedures, which is why it's important to train and professionalize at this time. At a world level, we have the benefits of WTO trade facilitation agreements, so what's referred to as single window projects, single window to customs, where it's more digitized and electronic. So we're coming sort of towards the end of these slides now, but this is one I've called out before around communication. So communicate, customers, suppliers, stakeholders like freight forwarders, like your bank, become important. Credit reference agencies, whether it's Dun & Bradstreet, Graydon, Experian, Equifax, Credit Watch, and other credit reference agencies, all become very, very important at all times, but obviously accentuated at the moment. So let's now sort of look about how COVID-19 will influence future trade. So this is looking at the future and looking at what could happen, and I'm very happy to take questions on this. This is an area the Institute will be speaking a lot more about future direction of travel and the way world trade is changing. Countries are clearly looking at how international trade can be approved, how it can be made improve, more electronic. India has announced it is digitising bills of lading, electronic bills of lading, and it's looking to effectively implement that across all export-import transactions. Been a big demand in terms of trade with India, become far more electronic. More direct transaction between the trader and the carrier. We're going to look at an example for the air freight supply chain. Use of blockchain to simplify how goods move, and bear that in mind when we look at air freight shortly. Electronic airway bills. We're going to look at some statistics that were introduced. The UK has announced a new UK Tech Export Academy, which again looking very much at tech exports of services. That's a major initiative and recognises the UK's strength in this area. And when you're just generally clear and precise communications, so understanding of business language and culture, because there can be miscommunications from, say, misunderstanding of the English language and certain terms. So it's very, very important in having those clear and precise communications, potentially as there's less face-to-face meetings taking place. So how will COVID-19 influence how we trade and do business? More online meetings, online negotiations, increased use of 3D printing, new product development to reduce the risk of contracting the virus. So the example, the picture on screen is for example, a hands-free door handle attachment. Export sales opportunities, whether it's linked to machines, robotics, as we've seen, continued growth in online deliveries, and that I'm sure will continue to increase. We now, a lot of the consumers and even industry have got used to this concept of online deliveries. But also at the same time, an emphasis on environmental and sustainable products. Very, very important for business, the impact of environmental sustainability, both in terms of consumer behavior towards products that are positive to the environment, but also the behavior of countries. So a lot of aid agency funding, for example, to purchase products from businesses in developed nations is linked to environmental and sustainability. The slide on screen, I'm not going to talk through it much, talks about the top emerging technologies. This was from the World Economic Forum, and you can see probably again a direction of travel here, and this was before COVID-19, around medical, a lot around medical, to improve people's lives and to create a more simplified environment. I'd like to pass back to Will now for another poll. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So yeah, we're going to, just following Kevin's slide just then, we're going to do another poll now. So this is, which of the following emerging technologies do you see yourself using post-COVID? Obviously, this would be not relevant to everyone, but hopefully we'll get a good sense. It'll be quite interesting to see the answers to this. The options are 3D printing, robotics/AI, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and then we've got augmented reality. And just a reminder, while I let people answer that poll, that you are more than welcome to ask questions to Kevin, which will be going on to a Q&A in just a few slides' time. It's a great opportunity to ask Kevin about any kind of trade issues coming out of COVID. All you need to do is use the question panel on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. Just click on the drop down and you can type a question there, and I shall try to ask it later. So give people a few more seconds to answer that poll. And even if it's not necessarily your business using it, maybe it's just which technology do you think will have more of an influence, say? Give a few more seconds. It'd be good to get at least a few more. Kevin, do you have any predictions on what the answer might be to this one?
I don't know actually. I'm going to wait and see. It's quite interesting when we discuss putting this in. It'd be quite interesting to see what the output is. So I think I'll wait and see. Thank you.
Fair enough. Right, so I'll give people 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Or just a couple more people answering. Okay, let's show the results now. So people were able to do multiple selections on this, so it won't add up to 100, but we've got 40% of people said robotics AI, that's followed by 3D printing. Blockchain is next on 29%, and then augmented reality is 20%. Any surprises there, Kevin?
No, it's really interesting. I guess the top two probably on balance make perfect sense. So, but we are going to see increase in aspects in our whole working environment, and the likes of 3D printing. COVID-19 has had quite a big impact in that respect. So, thank you everyone again for advising. That's it's really great to get your feedback, and say it's something we'll be looking at more because of the importance to how we trade going forward. Only got a couple more slides before we very much open it up to questions. So this is an example when I talked about complex supply chains and how blockchain could change the way we work. In this case, with the air freight supply chain, just details all the different participants in the air freight supply chain. With blockchain, the concept is a more direct interaction between the shipper, so the exporter, and effectively the carrier, in this instance, the airline. And the airlines, I think, are under pressure, certainly for that, to simplify, and blockchain is seeking to simplify that. You can obviously consider that in terms of the sea freight supply chain as well, but in the air freight supply chain, there are lots of different participants here. So, and the idea of blockchain, you have that more direct linkage between the shipper, the exporter, and the airline themselves. So just wanted to sort of show you that example to see how the likes of blockchain could start impacting the way we trade. Just statistics here on the emergence of the electronic airway bill. So effectively from 2019, the electronic airway bill became the formal contract of carriage, as opposed to the paper airway bill, which will be familiar. And those of you involved in the industry will be aware of this initiative. So the idea of the electronic airway bill, and again, we could replace this with a bill of lading and other documents as well, removes the need for paper-based processes. It speeds up the process, faster delivery times, a reduction in handling errors, more electronic, and obviously less paper is a positive impact on the environment. We can see the growth in statistics. Now, clearly the volume of electronic airway bills has gone down, which has reflected the impact of COVID-19 as a whole in impacting air freight. But the penetration continues to increase. So if we look at the countries, China has the highest penetration in terms of electronic airway bills. I'll say actually, no, China doesn't have. Sorry, China is high, but the likes of Singapore, Taipei have higher, and South Korea. So a lot of the Asian nations have very high penetration of electronic airway bills. The United Kingdom is lower at 49% or nearly 15%, 50%, and sometimes it's linked to the actual airline. But we can see that the UK is increasing, which is good, but still below the Asian nations. So in terms of supply chain efficiency, the UK will catch up, I'm sure, but at the moment the strengths in electronic are in the Asian nations. So really now coming towards the end, I've sort of gone through this slide before, so I'm not necessarily going to talk to it too much, but just to emphasize the importance of training at this time, and obviously the additional £50 million of grant funding that was announced last Friday is really important. Take the opportunity to train your staff, and perhaps not just a reliance on one person, but more people are aware of procedures. Just-in-time supply chains, fast processes require people to act, employees to act really quickly. So their understanding of trade procedures. And to keep reinforcing, as we always do, we can't just rely on third parties for likes of customs declarations. You as the trader are ultimately responsible for customs declaration, not the broker who's making the declaration on your behalf. You are accountable to the authorities. Final thing, which I've talked about before, is really share your experiences. We're very keen to hear your experiences, both in trade in general and COVID-19 impacts. I'm very happy to work with you. Our commitment, whether it's through our masterclasses, the Open to Export webinars, those of you involved with the UK Customs Academy will be aware we're very committed and we work a lot with other organisations. I've spoken on webinars with many other organisations in the last few weeks and months around the impacts of trade, so which is great, but we're here to keep you informed. Thank you. So I'll pass back to Will now again. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. One last poll before we go into the Q&A. It's one of our weekly trackers again. The poll is, are you still able to dispatch or receive component parts or good? The options are yes, yes, but with delays, or no. And while I let people answer that question, I'll ask a question for you, Kevin. So the first question I've got is from Angela, who's asked about the impact of COVID-19 on the imports and demand for food. So a bit of a sector-based one.
Yeah, no, again, thank you very much for the question. So it's a really good question. I guess it might depend what type of food it is. It's probably fair to say that if it's, for example, products of animal origin, that it's had an impact in that products of animal origin, when they enter the European Union and the UK during the transition period, have to be approved for a border inspection post. So less availability for sanitary, phytosanitary SPS checks means that they're potentially an impact, which can impact imports, can impact exports. If it's products that are part of the food manufacturing supply chain, there could be a positive need there in that there's a need to provide certain products that consumers need to purchase for food. So it does probably depend on the impact there, but where inspections are required, it becomes very important. There is, as we probably know, when we go to supermarkets or shop online, a link towards the more essential products as well, the mass market products that sell, to try and simplify the number of products that are being sold at this time. So that for businesses, that would depend on where your product fell, whether you had a unique product or a mass market product as well. But what it emphasizes is the need to work with suppliers, with customers, to try and make sure that goods pass through the supply chain. It also emphasizes the need for customs special procedures, customs authorizations like warehousing, like transit, and possibly authorized economic operator status, so that goods move quickly through supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm just going to show the results to this question. So 58% yes without delays, 39% still seeing some delays, and only 3% saying no. And that number's been low for a while, so that's good news. Can we have the next slide, please, Kevin? So yes, we can now get into some questions. As mentioned before, please do feel free to ask questions using the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We've had a question in from Alan. It's a bit of a long one, but he said one of his customers had a recent shipment of PPE held in France. The product did not bear CE marking, but it was held due to lack of CE type test or audit reports, which caused not only a delay, but a monetary impact. What guidance would you consider offering? I do not believe that they are fully conversant in CE legislation. So quite a specific one, but an interesting case study for CE marking.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Yeah, so other than to reinforce, obviously, the point around the importance of the CE marking, but if you're using a notifying body, and there is a list of approved notifying bodies by country, so in this case that would include France, then it's very important to get the test reports as well. So any due diligence undertaken by the notified body make sure you have it, you retain it. That's important for the purposes of the authorities, but also for reassurance as well, possibly reassurance from the from both the supply side and the customer side as well. So in interactions with the likes of notified bodies, very, very important. If you are supplying to the likes, sorry, apologies, if you're supplying to the likes of national health services, charities as well, is also to make sure you have documentation around the actual transaction, or if it's a donation that you're importing, for example, to have documentation. So documentation and records, whether it's a notified body, your customer, is very important. But a great question, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And a really good question from Ranjana is, should companies be considering bringing supply chains closer to home to protect against any future lockdowns and shutdowns? And I guess just in general, should companies be looking at rehoming or diversifying?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There has been action taken by some countries. I think Japan was probably one of the most visible in terms of reshoring a lot from China. Clearly, distance is less of a factor there, but in general, reshoring has been a consideration by many businesses, and it is potentially very important. Certainly in times of COVID-19, the ability to access supply chains is important, whether that's national supply chains, regional, geographical, nearby supply chains. So generally the answer is businesses should be considering supply chains, should be considering the location of supply chains, but also try and avoid key supplier dependency. So you're reliant on one supplier, even if that supplier is national or regional. In the event of problems, as we saw, for example, in Beijing and spikes, or Seoul, for example, in South Korea, in terms of spikes in cases, a reliance on one location, on one supplier, is not always the best place to be in. But certainly reshoring is something a lot of countries are looking at, and from a supply chain perspective, planning, procurement perspective, it makes perfect sense.
Thank you, Kevin. We've had a question from Raymond about export license applications. And I know it's not quite COVID related, but there have been difficulties I think the export control units have faced with a lot of applications coming through. Do you have any updates about kind of what's happening with export licenses and the approval of them at the moment?
Yeah, first of all, I'll point out that we at the Institute, we have the export control profession for professionals operating in this industry, and that's not just for companies in the defence military sector, that's for any company, the export control profession. And we have specific webinars coming up on that topic. So do look out for that, because those will be essential around export licenses. So if you're exporting dual use goods, you will require an open general export license, and there is a list of the goods that are deemed to be dual use goods available. It's important to say that at the end of a transition period, export of dual use goods to the European Union will require an export license. So that becomes very, very important for businesses to consider. The number of open general export licenses, OGLs, will increase. With regard to COVID-19, it is fair to say that some products may require an export license, even products within PPE, and clearly gas masks would be one example of that. So do consider that. We had a PPE masterclass when we looked at examples of products that would require an export license, and clearly if you're selling goods to military overseas or governments overseas, you need to consider that as well. And also software, encrypted software can often require an export license. Unfortunately, the way the world is at the moment, there is pressure on requirements, and we saw that last year with exports to certain Middle Eastern states, which were potentially being used in, or the theory was that they're being used in states such as Yemen and Syria, even though they were being exported to other countries in the Middle East. So it has put pressure on the authorities, but do listen out to our webinars in terms of export licenses, because it is a hugely important topic, because more products can have this dual use. They could have a military purpose as well as a seemingly innocent civilian purpose.
Thank you, Kevin. And we've done a few of these webinars before as well, so you can catch recordings of them on the Open to Export website as well. We've had, you touched on it in the slides, but we've had a couple of questions about the impact of the pandemic on Brexit. A couple of them asking, will the UK be ready? I'm not sure if we can speculate on that, but I mean, in terms of how people can get ready, could you just reiterate, I suppose, the options people have for preparing for Brexit?
Yeah, and it's something we refer to a lot. And again, use the £50 million of grant funding as well. It's very much there to help businesses prepare for Brexit and their action planning. It doesn't matter what size of company you are, what type of product you are. It's important for every single type of organisation. So businesses need to review their trading profile, the countries they're trading with. They need to keep up to date with announcements. I've referred to the likes of the UK global import tariff, the import controls. And as we talked about this morning and this morning's webinar, part of the reason for the three-stage import controls was a recognition that companies need assistance, especially those companies that are only trading with the European Union currently, during these difficult times of COVID-19. And part of the reason for introducing these import controls was to help that preparation process and give some companies the opportunity to defer making a full customs declaration. But please listen to our webinar this morning to expand on that. But also what it does show is, by introducing this, is the UK is clearly saying that the transition period ends on the 31st of December. So by introducing these import controls, it is almost saying that these will start from the 1st of January, stage one, as we talked about this morning. So businesses have to prepare on that basis. The transition period will end at the end of December, and that preparation now really does mean looking at opportunities as well, what countries you're trading with, and the opportunity to professionalize your trade procedures and gain hopefully competitive advantage. Thank you.
Thank you. And I should clarify that obviously we've already left the EU, so I meant end of the transition phase, not Brexit, because we're all post-Brexit now. A question from Peter. He's asked, based on the easing of lockdown in Europe and some of the Far East countries, when do you think countries like Brazil will be open again for trade?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think if you look at not just Brazil but other countries, certain African countries as well, there's been this dynamic, and even the United States, around the fact that they've tried, that they're seeing the impacts of the economy being just as serious, the impact on the economy, as the impact of the virus itself. So the likes of Brazil have been more open for business in terms of internal in Brazil. If you look at the cycle in other countries, where China first of all, then across to Europe, we can see that lockdown, and we can see the time period in which it takes. That may give us some guidance, but equally the virus is clearly very prevalent in Brazil, and some of the actions maybe means that it could be, in some countries it could be quicker, it could be longer, and I know Peru, for example, and Chile have seen increase, in Mexico have seen increase in number of cases as well. So you could look at the cycle from other countries, but it will vary by country depending on their approach to the coronavirus, but also how much they've tried to keep their economies open. So I've been on 2 calls between the webinar this morning with 2 African countries whose borders are still shut. They've had relatively low numbers of coronavirus cases, and trade is taking place within the country. And there are imports into the country, certainly of commodities and components, but that the borders are still shut for travel. So it really does vary by country in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And if I could squeeze one more two-parter, just gathering a few questions together. Angela's asked a couple of questions about online. I think the gist of her questions are, do you think businesses will need to be more adept at doing kind of the soft parts of business online? So the negotiations and the kind of getting to know business partners. And then a question from Florence has asked, how can B2C exporters plan their export strategies given all the changes which are happening at the moment? So a two-parter there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So yes, online meetings, online negotiations have been far more prevalent during COVID-19. I know some people would say, well, you can't replace the face-to-face element, and it is difficult. We've all very much become used to those face-to-face discussions, meetings. So it is likely to still be prevalent, and it might depend which countries are out of lockdown when travel becomes business travel becomes opens up more. But I think, yeah, businesses have to prepare for more online meetings and online use of online platforms, and it is probably going to become more prevalent in the future, and we've driven that way. But again, shouldn't necessarily replace face-to-face meetings in a more normal business environment. B2C is an interesting one. It's easy for me to say, well, e-commerce is all about e-commerce. That's the way future. But it is important to say that businesses must consider their websites, both from a sales tool, but also a fulfillment tool as well. How easy is it to communicate from consumers with your website? How user-friendly it? How is it for payment fulfillment? So whether that's PayPal, whether that's credit, debit card, etc. How set up is it for that? And how secure clearly is it as well, because certainly consumers will be concerned about what's the policy on repairs, refunds. That becomes very, very important as well. No one wants bad write-ups around goods having to be returned, and the business certainly doesn't want to have to be working with returns and repairs all the time. So there's a number of things to consider there in terms of a B2C e-commerce strategy. But very, very important. It's not just about how wonderful the website looks. It's the component features about how easy is it to make payment, to take payment. What does payment security look like? Are there any hidden charges? Are they visible in this? And what's the policy about returns and repairs? Number of things to consider there, but a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And yes, I think on that note, we will have to wrap up because we've slightly overrun, but some great questions, as Kevin said. And a reminder that we will be sending a recording of this webinar out to everyone afterwards, and you can contact us for a copy of the slides. But in terms of upcoming webinars, the next Open to Export webinar will be looking at insurance options for exporters. That's with Gallagher on July 3rd. Before then, our partners at the UK Customs Academy are running 2 webinars next week on moving goods into and out of the UK post-transition on Tuesday, and on looking at the potential implications of the Irish Protocol on Friday. We'll be sending you a link to all of those webinars in the next week or so. And you can view a recording of today's webinar, as already mentioned, but also the webinar this morning on the 3-phase plan for introducing customs checks. That will be on the website before the end of tomorrow at the very latest. Next, please. The Institute is still online doing all of our range of online support and telephone assistance throughout the pandemic. This includes digital training courses, export masterclasses, international trade surgeries, which can be done over the phone, online qualifications from both the Institute and the UK Customs Academy, daily bulletins bringing you all the key trade stories, and of course the free articles and webinars on the Open to Export platform. And just in terms of the practicalities of coming out of lockdown, you can access, or members of the Institute can access, the new help desk and document library called the IRE Business Shield. This covers all your HR, health and safety, legal and tax issues, including support for managing the furlough scheme and safely returning to work. There's more information on all that at export.org.uk. Next slide, please. And finally, through these historic times, it's really important we support each other and share information and best practice around how to do global trade in challenging times ahead. Membership with the Institute gives you a support network and wealth of information to ensure that you have everything that you need to meet the challenges of global trade. To find out more about membership with the IRE, please do look at the site expert.org.uk/membership, and our membership services team will always be happy to answer any questions you may have. Now, that's all from us today. I've been speaking very quickly there because we've overrun, but we hope you found today's webinar useful, and please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought. Till next time, stay safe and goodbye.